say 60 trillion. We have India and China, 40% or close to 40% of the world's population. 20 years ago, we had less than 10% of world GDP, but if you look at it in terms of purchasing power parity, today India and China account for roughly 20%, about a fifth of the world economy. The power balance of the planet has shifted inexorably eastwards. And so the future of the planet depends now on India and China, doesn't it?
Indeed. Well, I think this is fundamentally interesting and important. If I may add, what happened in China is that China has had peace and not war. And it was only when peace has continued for as long as it has, social peace, domestic peace, relatively speaking, after the Mao era, it is when social peace became, that economic growth could be looked at. And there was no further foreign aggression, etc. China has been at peace for quite a long time. In India, it's more complicated, but what is common to both, it seems to me, is that we have very large populations. We have, relatively speaking, as you said, very stable social structures and family structures.
Fast-growing economies.
But why are they fast-growing? Because I would say we have had very low capital per head to start with. The capital per capita...
As I say, the base was very narrow.
Well, the capital stock per person has been very small. Now, what has happened now, very interestingly, I think, is that with the information technology revolution, suddenly that capital stock has vastly increased, because now it is no longer bricks and mortar capital, it is also information capital. So to talk about the growth of the IT sector in India, for example, is because we don't have to migrate to the United States to do the job. You can do it from Bangalore or Hyderabad because the technology has changed. So that technological change, it was something that we didn't cause. India did not cause it. It was a byproduct of the end of the Cold War, that this technology suddenly zoomed. And if you think this is 2012, if you think where we were in 1990, 91, 92, and how it has changed over 20 years, it is absolutely incredible. It's remarkable. I gave lectures in Bangalore on this at the Indian Institute of Information Technology. So what I'm trying to say is that the individual becomes more empowered.
Okay.
And all that population, which is so large.
Are you arguing that now India and China stand to leverage information technology perhaps better than other parts of the world?
I think I'm saying that output can be produced here less expensively, because we now have access to this capital, which we didn't have to go and find or even grow. We just got it.
1 minute. I mean, some would say we used to be cyber coolies. Now we are sort of graduated. We are becoming knowledge workers. Or is that an exaggerated view?
Well, that's a matter of our national identity and lack of it, or the weakness there, it seems to me. And both China and India, I think, have got extremely grave governance problems. And for public finance problems.
And corruption.
Indeed, as a byproduct. If your public finances are clean, then corruption is also low. And if the public finance is not only clean, but also efficient and working.
1 minute. How is it that India and China appear to have been relatively insulated from the worst ravages of the international financial crisis? And how come? China, if you include exports, imports, remittances, invisible earnings and all that, it's about 80% of Chinese GDP. In India, that proportion is far lower. It's about half. China's economy is far more integrated than India's economy, but these two countries have been, compared to others, have been relatively insulated.
I'm not sure that. I think the Chinese have been very badly affected by the recession. And you've pointed to something absolutely critical between the two countries, between China and India. Both, for example, and I've said this at the other talk the other day, both have had vastly, quickly growing foreign exchange reserves, which they never had before. Suddenly we've got foreign exchange reserves.
We really don't know China's foreign exchange reserves. We only guess how much money China has kept it in the U.S. Federal Reserve. I mean,
no.
India's...
they have foreign exchange reserves as a country. The foreign exchange reserves are a residual in the balance of payments, as you remember. That it's a residual amount in the balance of payments. There's a current account, there's a capital account. You subtract one from the other, errors and omissions, and you have foreign exchange reserves. Now, they're not a bad thing. They're a good thing to have large foreign exchange reserves. But I have to say, and this is something I've been pointing to for some time, is that there is a fundamental difference in the nature of their foreign exchange reserves and our foreign exchange
Explain.
reserves. Precisely. Theirs arose, if you remember, their growth begins in the early 80s.
Correct.
And they start...
And then for a period of about 3 decades, the Chinese economy grows at double digits or more.
Well, I'm speaking of actually the manufactured exports to the West, specifically manufactured exports to the West. They have a conscious policy of wanting to take over from Japan and Korea and Taiwan, and they want to produce things like umbrellas, children's toys.
They produce almost all the children's toys in the world.
Well, they were.
Textiles, garments.
Well, just a sec. But you see, what I'm trying to say is umbrellas, children's toys, overcoats, gumboots, gardening equipment, anything. Walmart example, to go back to when you have Walmarts and Kwats and then mass markets in America, they were being penetrated very, very deeply by Chinese products.
75% of what Walmart sells in the U.S. is made in China.
Indeed. And the Chinese were doing that back in the 80s. Now they're selling computers and higher technology. If you can see, there's a difference between, as technology grows, between learning how to sell umbrellas and learning how to sell children's toys and then learning how to sell computers. Exactly. So that evolution has happened. And they gained their reserves absolutely clearly because their manufactured exports were so high, and they penetrated Western markets with their inexpensive products.
But
you with me?
Yes.
Now contrast that with India's growth of foreign exchange reserves, because
we had a crisis in 1991 because our forex reserves that dipped to 2 weeks imports requirement. But since then, they've been fairly comfortable.
Well, comfortable. My point is that the Chinese reserves are being caused by growth of manufactured exports. Ours have been caused, I'm afraid, and they're much more fragile as a result, by borrowing.
Okay. Including foreign institutional investors.
Well, yes.
So-called hot money.
So we have allowed this kind of capital. We've increased our inequalities as a result. Now, some manufacturing.
But some would say the same has happened in China as well.
Yes, partly. But what I'm saying is that their manufacturing export base is far superior to ours. We are, if you look at, I did a study for the IMF. This is what I was at the IMF for in '93, based on what is called SITC data from Geneva. Standard information, standard international trade classification. So you have, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then you have 4 different categories of different export products. And what I was asked to do by the IMF over different departments, it was a cross-departmental study of India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. And why they had to get me from the outside to do it as an external consultant. The IMF does not normally take consultants. This is because Pakistan was refusing to be part of the Indian department. Anyhow. So what I did was it might be the only study that has since been done in '93 of manufactured exports of these 4 countries to the Western economy, to the major buyers.
What's the main point you are driving at?
What I'm trying to say is that there is no export supply curve. There is an import demand function, which, in other words, what do the importers want to demand from you?
So you're saying the shrinking of demand in Europe, in US is also now the main contributory factor to the slowing down of the rate of growth of both the Chinese economy and the Indian?
Not quite.
Not so much the Indian economy, Chinese economy.
If one is careful about imports and exports, and one should be careful, one ought to have a scientific study using SITC data, as I call it, as it is called. And what that shows is what we might say we are exporting this to country A. Country A then reports what they receive from us. They report the same thing to Geneva. So which is more reliable, or what the country says it's exporting, or what the country which is receiving says it's imported from that country? So what I was doing was looking at what were the receipts of these other countries from India, as opposed to what we were saying we were sending.
How much do you eliminate all the invoicing fiddles?
Well, I'm not sure. I didn't get into that detail. But the point is that if we look at the structure of Indian exports, this is this part of the study again. In the 19th century, we had 4% of world trade. This collapses to 2% of world trade in mid-century, 20th century. And by the 80s and 90s, it's up to half of 1%.
Yes, less than 1%.
So we have shrunk in the world economy. Now, what happened is, why it shrank is a very complex and difficult question, a very important question, which India's foreign trade people should be looking at. But the point is that once you've lost a market, let's say in textiles, and one of the numbers I found was that India had 16% of the US textile market, manufactured textiles, right through the 50s and 60s. That collapses to 10, that collapses to 5. And now it collapses partly because of Western protectionism, because they had their own barriers. It collapses partly because of the rupee and exchange rate problems. So the point is we lose our traditional markets, manufactured textiles, and, for example, clothing and traditional export goods, jute, and so forth.
Okay, I have a last question before I take the third and the final break in our discussion. The WTO is in a state of limbo. The Doha development round is, well, more than a decade old. It's dead as a dodo. The West refuses to give in on farm subsidies. The developing countries don't want their economies to be priced open, to be opened up further. Levels of protectionism are on the rise, and the so-called rule-based multilateral system seems to be almost dead and gone. I mean, people are furiously signing bilateral and multilateral or plurilateral trade agreements and investment cooperation agreements and so on and so forth. So what do you see as the future of the WTO? I mean, after all, 2009, for the first time after 7 decades, ever since data was collected by the erstwhile GATT and WTO, we saw a sharp fall in world trade. I mean, some say 8%, some say 15%.
I think it's very disturbing, but it's been, and as you rightly point out, it has been knocked off the stage by the macroeconomic developments which happened. In other words, the recession in the United States, the troubles with the euro in Europe, Japan's problems, all these three combined, and the whole world trade discussion which was happening which was going on quite merrily for many years and almost a few decades, suddenly got knocked off the stage. Because now we are back to a situation where countries are looking at their own individual national interest much more deeply than they're concerned about the other. So there is a beggar my neighbor kind of attitude towards this. Again, I would say that India's problems have less to do with that than our own domestic mismanagement of macro and fiscal problems, and the exchange rate, and also the convertibility of the rupee, which is what I talk about.
So that's really where I'm going to talk to you in the final 12 minutes of our conversation. Look at India's domestic economic problems. Problems of the deficit, problems of inflation, problems of growth, mixed economy, mixed up economy. These are the last few questions I'm going to ask you, but I take a final break. We'll be back with you in a short while from now. This is an interview with Dr. Subroto Roy, economist, and we're going to discuss India in the fourth and the final segment of this interview. Stay with us. We'll be back with you. Welcome back to the fourth and the final segment of this discussion with economist Dr. Subroto Roy. Dr. Roy, growth versus inflation. These are being posited as almost binary opposites. We have the finance minister often expressing his displeasure that the Reserve Bank of India is not softening interest rates. The Reserve Bank of India saying that's because the government is not done enough to control inflation, to contain inflation. Fiscal measures have not worked out. So monetary policy is having to play a disproportionately bigger role in trying to control inflation. How would you describe the current state of India's economy 2 decades and a little longer after there was a shift rightwards, if you like? The center of India's economy and polity shifted rightwards post-91.
Well, thanks. I've been personally and deeply involved in this whole debate, except not within the government, but outside the government. There was a project at the University of Hawaii which I brought to Rajiv Gandhi in 1990, and that I've claimed contributed to the origins of the 91 reform. What I think one has to ask what the 91 reform was about, and I think, if anything, it was about the definition of government. What ought government to do and what ought not government to do. That suddenly became a relevant issue, which is now ongoing. Now, in the last 20 years, or 22 years, it seems to me we've had a lot of microeconomic success, and we've had lots of real growth because of technological change, because of progress, because of institutional change, the stock market in Bombay, and all these technological changes which are unimaginable have happened over 20 years. At the same time, there's been, I think, extremely grave and deep macroeconomic corrosion in the banking system, specifically, and in the nature of public finance in India. So, and I'm afraid I don't see either the Ministry of Finance or the Reserve Bank or the Planning Commission or any of the government institutions or the international institutions. I don't see the World Bank or the IMF or any of these folks either, really being aware of how deep the problem is.
How deep is this problem? And how would you, if I ask you to, in simple language, explain, why do you say this problem is a deep-rooted one?
Well, that's, thank you. It's deep-rooted because it is not, we don't understand the process that we are part of. And we are part of a process, in my analysis. If we look at the data from 39 to today, 39 again is when the war begins, Second World War begins. And we are a subject nation at that point. And what the British do is they do three things which have continued. One is they clamp down on exchange controls over the sterling area and they bring in import restrictions for the war. The second is there's a vast increase in military spending. And the third is, naturally because it's a war, and the third is that there is a monetization of the deficit. And that leads to the highest money supply growth ever, between 39 and 42.
and you're saying that's the way we've continued?
We've not only continued, we've extended that. We've extended it, we've deepened it, and we failed to comprehend what process we were part of. So we changed that from military economy, war economy, to socialist economy.
1 minute. Were we ever socialist? You know, I mean, Nehru wanted us to be a mixed economy. Many argue we took the worst of both worlds. You know, we had license-controlled Raj. Now we have crony capitalism. You know, we didn't even provide healthcare and education to the bulk of our people, which the so-called socialist or the communist countries tried to do, whether it be the erstwhile Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, Cuba, etc. So, in a sense, we took the worst of all the worlds.
Indeed, I have a common theory, which is, I think, Marxist on the one hand, and Milton Friedman, my friend, my late great friend Milton Friedman, both agree. Namely, that there is, I think, a Marxist theory, if we think about it, has sometimes been that there was never any real independence, that the national bourgeoisie and the
it was politically independent, but we didn't have economic independence.
Yes, and the British left.
Or social independence.
The British left, and there was no economic independence. The British left, and we, our higher classes, took over the roles the British had, and essentially continued on. That is, the Marxist theory is very confused, but when it comes out coherently, there is that to be said. At the same time, it seems to me that there is this terrible inequality, which a free market economist would point to.
Like Milton Friedman, your friend.
Yeah,
so this is where the right and the left come together.
Friedman came in 1955 at the invitation of the government of India in November 1955 when we were very little.
You were just born.
I was just born.
I was just born too, yes.
And he wrote a memorandum, which I came to for the government, where, for example, he talked about monetary and fiscal stability. He talked about India having the newly sovereign India following the Canadian pattern. Canada was the only currency which had a floating currency, and he talked about the benefits we could have from that and so on. What we did was we didn't discuss that at all. We buried it. We suppressed the document. And then I finally published it in Hawaii in '89, 34 years later. And I certainly came to Rajiv Gandhi in 1990 with the project that I discussed. Now, foreign exchange control has been, I think, deep, and it has been, and the release of foreign exchange and the relaxation of foreign exchange control has been one which has increased inequality in India. Increased inequality, because those who want sort of big business, NRIs, the military, government, they have access to almost as much foreign exchange as they want. We have a story in the papers today about some 55,000 crores being spent on submarines being bought from A, B, or C. And this military budget is, as I've said before, is a kind of black hole in Indian public finance. Nobody knows what's going on, nobody knows where, but it always gets foreign exchange at once. So to contrast that with what the debates going on in Parliament now about this gas cylinder for this poor person, for his four gas cylinders or 6 gas cylinders, it becomes absurd. You see,
right. I guess I could have talked to you all night, but I just have a few minutes left before I have to conclude this program. So if I ask you to summarize in bullet points, what, according to you, are the key problems of the Indian economy at this juncture, and what would you advocate as some of the important ways forward?
Well, I would say comprehending things candidly, finding the data, getting the data in a scientific
more
manner.
transparency.
getting the data in a scientific manner. We can't talk about, I will talk about, let's look at the fetish over growth rates. You know, somebody says 6.5, somebody says, no, it's not 6.5, 6.25, somebody says, no, it's 7.2, somebody says, no, it's not 7.2, it's 8.3 for sure. It's ridiculous.
We don't really know because that data keeps getting changed over and over again for years.
It's not just the data. We have no models. There is no model that I know of, and I've challenged the government institutions on this. Let the Reserve Bank produce its models, its macroeconomic models. Produce it publicly. This is a scientific exercise. What are the endogenous variables? What are the exogenous variables? What are the structural parameters? Where is the data series? Let the finance ministry do the same thing. Let the planning commission and its leaders do the same thing. Let the World Bank, and there aren't any.
No, but aren't India's problems far more basic?
Well, it's a matter of
infrastructure, social infrastructure,
well,
healthcare, education, physical infrastructure,
indeed.
roads, bijli, sarak, pani,
Of course. But all those come out once you understand once you comprehend the public finances. If you comprehend the public finance of Maharashtra, UP, as I've tried to do, or West Bengal, you get to see what are the assets, what are the liabilities, what is the income, what is the expenditure, where is the expenditure going. And if you start looking at those things carefully, then you find that the present state of accounting, government accounting, is so opaque. It's not just a matter of bringing in transparency, it's a matter of changing the methodology and wanting to say, look, let us find out where the money is going. And corruption would be the decline in corruption would be a byproduct of that process.
Okay. So if I can summarize of the many, many things that you've said today, and that's a difficult job, one way forward would be to ensure that the way in which public finances are taken care of in this country needs to be made far more transparent and accessible to large numbers of comprehensive,
and improve the integrity of the currency that we use, both internally, so there's inflation, we tackle inflation, and externally, so that the currency becomes moves towards becoming a global currency.
Okay, so time alone will tell whether the future of the Indian economy is bright or whether we're going to sort of bungle along. Are you optimistic?
I have a blog called independentindian.com, and you'd find me talking there very often, so people can tune in and listen to it and by all means participate.
Well, Dr. Roy, it's been a pleasure having you here on the program, and I hope the viewers of this program will enjoy listening to your views, even though they may not agree with everything you say, as much as I've enjoyed talking to you. As I said earlier, I could have discussed these issues with you all night, but I have to end now. Thank you so much for being with us on this program. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us on this program.